Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining me for another inner hour. I'm going to pause just a moment here and take a take a breather and light my candle. So if you need one of some kind as well, just do that. Righty. So, starting a new series tonight that I think I've decided to call it The Great Souls in History or something along those lines. So we'll call it that, The Great Souls of History. First of all, to those who are either Christian or in some way celebrate and honor the life of Yeshua, known as Jesus in English. Happy Easter, and I hope you had a good weekend so far. Uh, there's lots of themes around this time of year, both inside and outside of Christianity. Of course, dealing with Jesus's resurrection and so on inside Christianity, and outside it, uh, sometimes inside it in the mystical Christian movements. Themes like rebirth, regeneration, um, resurrecting the divine essence, in us, and those sorts of themes. Spring has been a rebirth time in most cultures around the world, celebrated by something. So we're into that time. So may it be a blessed time for all of us, and may we appreciate the rebirth going on around us in nature and the potential for rebirth in us also. I'm not actually doing a theme on Easter today. There's lots of that available if you have not already experienced it, it's readily available. So this great souls in history theme, uh, there's a couple of goals that I personally have with it. We'll see as usual where it goes. I hope some of you find this interesting. I hope a lot of you find it interesting and useful as well. But it's not something that is often talked about. I've rarely heard it, very rarely heard it put together in this fashion, and I have not often presented it this way. Um, but it's kind of a timeline of great spiritual movements and teachers throughout our written history. And I will name a few of them that I intend to touch on in this series. Once again, recognizing that any one of these could be a long-term study, but just kind of to touch on them to give you some familiarity of their sort of core or basic teachings, and because some of them you may not be familiar with, and also to show a relationship dynamic between them and how the movement of spirit moves through the human timeline and has surges at different points. For those of you that were with me for the last series, which is a lot of you, if not all of you, we talked somewhat about the good and evil thing. And when the evil part was touched on, we talked about there have been various times where there's been kind of this influx or surge of the evil force energy dynamic trying to intercede in human affairs, uh, and that there are various time periods where that happens. Well, there's also time periods where there's huge surges of spiritual awakening and enlightenment that is accompanied by the arrival of great teachers during that era. So that's what I'll be talking about in this series. I'll just name you a few of them. I've got a little list of people I hope to get to in this series. Probably have heard of most of them. One is Zor, so I'll just read a few. I'll just read them. Zoroaster, Moses, Akhenaten and Nefertiti, King David, Prophet Isaiah, Pythagoras, Buddha, Socrates, Jesus, whom I call Yeshua, Saint Francis, also Saint Clare, Teresa of Avila, Rabbi Isaac Luria, known as the Ari, Rabbi Israel Ben Eliezer, known as the Baal Shem Tov, Ben Franklin, George Washington, John Adams. I know you probably don't think of them as spiritual teachers, and Ralph Waldo Emerson, who is probably the most prominent of the transcendentalists in the 1860s or so. So those are ones I hope to touch on. If there are some that are important to you that you would like me to mention, send me an email. And if I know anything about them, I'll try to do that. But tonight I want to kind of introduce this with sort of an overarching theme of a connectedness of how spiritual teachers come forward and in what eras and what happens as a result of those things. I know, especially these days, it's very easy to believe that while our spiritual path hopefully affects us and makes our life better, it sometimes seems hard to really see that it has any impact on the world, especially as you see the world going insane and increasingly bad things happening, or apparently increasingly bad things happening. So I'm going to start back at about 4000 BC. The First of all, the time designation BC means before Christ, so before Jesus was born, and then AD means Anno Domini, which means in the year of our Lord. The That was the traditional reckoning for a long, long time. The more common scholarly references now is called BCE and CE, which really is exactly the same designation. They're just trying to get away from building it around Jesus, but it still is because BCE means before the Christian era, before the Common Era, and the Common Era started after his birth, and then CE means the Common Era, which is after his birth, and then BCE is everything before his birth. So it's still actually the same exact division. They're just calling it by something they think may be more politically correct or sensitive to non-Christians, maybe. But it's exactly the same division line. So if you see BCE or CE in anything you study, or that's the same as BC and AD that you would probably have grown up with more familiarly. So when we're back anywhere near this far, even back as far as Yeshua, um, everything's guesswork. It's an educated guesswork based on all the archaeological finds which continue to unfold and all the historical documentary finds and texts which also continue to unfold. So it's always increasing, and hopefully our understanding is getting a little more accurate as it goes on. But it's all uh, largely guesswork because the record keeping from back then was not what we would hope. And even when there were records kept, the material on which they were, it's like if you have, I came across some cassette tapes the other day of some things I really wanted, I've forgotten I had. And I went, oh boy, I've got these. These are great. And of course, there was no way to play them on anything because nobody has, I mean, hardly anybody has cassette players anymore. So, and then we have tons of VHS entertainment tapes, movies and shows that we like to watch on the old VHS tapes, which of course don't exist anymore either. And most of those players don't exist or are hard to find. So we can't play most of those. And then we got the DVDs, which then went to Blu-rays, which now is all digital and streaming. So, even our media gets outdated. But certainly when you're writing on paper or papyrus or vellum, it's outdated rather quickly. So lots of the documentation that they did have is gone. And then lots of it is still buried and maybe will be unearthed one day. So when I'm saying any of these dates, it's most scholars' consensus that these are probably in the right range, but who knows? So around 4000 BC, Adam and Eve, poof, the beginning of the human race in the Jewish and Christian chronicles. Start with Adam and Eve, which by Jewish calendar reckoning, and they have a whole different calendar system, and by other references that around that time that have been found. Scholars guess it's around 4000 BC when all that took place. So that's the first, let's say, major spiritual impetus is there's a new race of consciousness on Earth called human beings. And interestingly enough, the two oldest still existing religions in the world are Judaism and Hinduism. And Hinduism um, began to consolidate and be written down and be something. They don't call themselves that, they call themselves Sanatan Dharma, which means the eternal truth, basically, or the eternal reality. But we call it Hinduism. And much of that, including its principal text, the Bhagavad Gita, meaning the Song of the Lord, is about Krishna, the avatar Krishna, who was considered a human incarnation or a human embodiment of the god Vishnu, who is the creative god, the one who brought new things into being and gave new life. And guess when he came into being? Around the late 3800s or 4000 BC. Same time period, different culture, different era, but that's when their lineage started and that's when their sacred texts started. So all of a sudden, there's a huge influx in both East and West of these spiritual teachings that come forward. Um, guess what else happened toward the end of that period, within about 1,000 years of that time period, or maybe earlier, we don't really know. Guess what else happened? In yet a different culture, the ancient pyramids of Egypt were built. So lots going on in that less than 1,000-year period, starting around 4000 BC. In the what became the Jewish and then Christian and then Muslim cultures, and what became the Egyptian Arabic cultures, and what became the Indian and Eastern cultures. So big time period. If you've studied astrology, you know that one of their teachings is that about every 2,000 years, there's what they call a new age. What they mean by that is that if you put this artificial horoscope of 12 astrological houses up over the solar system, you find that our particular system moves into different. So if you think of it as a clock with 12, 12, 1, 2, and so on, from 12 to 1 is an age, from 1 to 2 is an age, each consisting of roughly 2,000 years. And so you move from the age of, Pisces into the age of Aquarius and so on. So that's an astrological teaching which a lot of New Age people have adopted. It's not very accurate, but it kind of does give a sense of roughly every 2,000 years, something significant happens, and there's a potential for a major consciousness shift. Astronomically, which is at the physical plane at least, much more accurate, also talks about that, but more accurately, and the term is precession of the equinoxes. Because from the vantage point of Earth looking out, certain things happen as Earth moves in relation to our sun, and our sun moves in relation to the center of the galaxy, which itself is but one galaxy, which moves in relation to the center of the core of the universe, and so on. So, but it's still roughly, the precession of equinoxes is more like 2,400 to 2,500 years, but you're still in that 2000-ish range where things happen or change significantly. So we could expect a major impetus of some kind of new spiritual teaching, if I'm right, around 2000 BC, after Adam and Eve, after Krishna, after the pyramids. And what you find is, guess what? The birth of Abraham and Sarah in the biblical testimony, which gave birth to all the nations we now know, both Jews and Arabs and non-Jews and non-Arabs, according to the biblical story, and eventually gave birth to the line of Moses, and the prophets, and then eventually down the road to Yeshua, and then to the gazillions of Christian denominations and Jewish denominations and non-denominations and all of those sorts of things. So, so that's at around 2000 BC. Now, there's another interesting thing that happens in in the interim of these 2000-year-ish segments, and usually somewhere around 1200 and 1500. I don't know why. There's an influx again, usually in the 1200s and usually in the 1500s. So I'm going to skip through a lot of time and a lot of history, and I'm going to move up to the 1500s BC. And in the 1500s BC, there are several things that happened, one of which we're pretty sure of, and that is the Mayan dynasty begins and lasts until about 250 or 300 AD, somewhere in there, 250, I think. Also, the Iron Age begins if you're into those kind of ages. Um, and also, the great culture of Egypt, which produced the pyramids, actually begins to decline. So all of that's happening around the 1200 BC range. And there's something else that may or may not be happening around the 1200 BC range, and scholars still argue about it. And some of them put it in the 12 to 1300 BC range, which fits with what I've just said. And some scholars put it in the 1500 BC range, which will fit with what I'm about to say in a moment. But here you are again, the 1200 or 1500s, and that is Moses and the Exodus. Wide range of dates that scholars do not agree on. They basically fall into two camps, and some of the scholars, more modern ones, believe that the Exodus took place in the late 1200s, early 1300s BC, and that was when under Moses and his brother Aaron, and you know that story. Other biblical scholars, including up until more recently, this was kind of the established version, was that all of that happened around 1500, around the late 1400s to early 1500s. But again, from my point of reference, 1200 to 1500 key events happen spiritually with an influx of things. So either it happened around the 1500s or it happened around the 1200s. The other thing that we're a little more sure of, because there are more corroborating external dates and documentation and archaeological discoveries, still quite flexible, is around 1313 BC. So we're in that 12 to 1500 period again. According to the Jewish calendar and according to Jewish oral tradition and later written tradition, the experience with Moses at Mount Sinai, at which the Torah was given, or what we think of as the Ten Commandments, was on the 6th day of the month of Shaban in the year 2448, which corresponds, if all the mathematicians do their math right, to the year 1313 BC of our calendar. And so you have not only the Hebrew calendar to translate, but then you have the old Julian calendar, which the Roman Empire used for ages, and then the more modern Gregorian calendar. So there's a lot of disagreement even on that level. But so somewhere around there, Torah was received. Torah is usually translated as law, but it's more accurately rendered as instruction or teaching. And so that's when the teachings that became Jewish teachings, became Judaism, came forward, out of which then grew Christianity and eventually Islam. So that's another important time period in the BC era. So also, interestingly enough, again, we don't really know when, but around 1000 to 1200, so there's the 1200 again, around 1000 to 1200 is when most of the kings of Israel happened, Saul, David, and Solomon. And so, again, exactly when, we don't know, but that era, so there's this huge influx, particularly with Solomon and David, and their influence on Judaism and their influence on the messianic theme in Judaism of one anointed by God to not only be king of Israel, but also to fulfill the introduction or the initiation of a new age of consciousness in which mankind will eventually worship the one true God, and where there will be a lot of the old ways will come to an end. And the Davidic messianic line is a promise and hope of that unfolding in the next age, which is the age we're now in, 2000 years. So that's all happening. And another mysterious figure that is who's named in Persia, his own language, was Zarathustra. In Greek was, and he's better known by that name, was called Zoroaster. He was a great teacher, influenced Judaism very strongly, and some scholars believe he was born in 1500 BC or thereabouts, and some scholars believe he was active more around 1000 to 1200, so 1500, 1200 again. So Zarathustra or Zoroaster is in the same era, roughly within a couple hundred years, maybe, of King David. So a different culture, great teacher, and then a Davidic line, another great teacher and culture. So my point in this that I'm trying to get through tonight, and I'll have a few more to go through, is there are time periods where there have been surges and where we can expect surges. And it's across cultures. It's not just in one. So if that's happening in one culture, something is happening in another culture in roughly that same era. So I'll go down. That also, after that period, you enter into the period of the prophets, which is another story in itself. But I want to point out when I talk about cross-cultural things, for example, going on almost simultaneously, from a big picture, simultaneously, from a little picture off 100 years or so. But in in the mid 500 BCs to mid 400 BCs, a lot was going on. Pythagoras was born and teaching in that period of time. The Persian Empire started in that period of time. Buddha, Gautama Buddha, was born in that period of time. Confucius was born in that period of time. Sun Tzu was born in that period of time. King Arthur was supposedly active in England at that time. Socrates was born at that time. So Greece, England, China, tremendous amount of stuff going on. And so in the Greek culture, for example, you go from Socrates and shortly after from Pythagoras, shortly after his death, Socrates, boom, comes up and starts teaching. And then boom, Plato comes up. He's born while Socrates is still alive, of course. And then shortly after him, boom, Aristotle comes up. So this succession of great teachers and philosophers in Greece in that era. At the same time, King Arthur is trying to establish for the first time ever a rule of law in England that's not based on the strongest winds, but actually based on a justice system that even the king is accountable to. And granted, a lot of that's legendary, but there was something going on to spark all of that. Exactly factually what it was, again, who knows? And at that same time, you have all of this stuff going on in Greece, and then these great teachers in the East, as I said, Confucius and Sun Tzu and Buddha and so on, all within, like, for example, most scholars date Buddha's time period is 550 to 475 BC. Sun Tzu was in exactly that same period of time. And Confucius was also exactly in that same period of time, within that same 50 years-ish time. All three of them alive and teaching. So that's kind of remarkable if you think about the influence those individual souls had on things. So the other piece of this, as far as these different surges or time periods where there's an influx of great teaching and great spiritual energy, um, another one is during the transition between the ages. So when the end of an age occurs and another one gets going, there's a lag. It's not a clean cut. It doesn't stop, boom, and then another one starts. This one fades out, and this one gradually increases and comes into being. So there's a transition period, and it's usually a while. And by a while, I mean maybe 100 years, sometimes a little less, sometimes a little more. And during that time period, there's another great, great influx of both spiritual awakening and teaching and direct opposition to it with this dark force that we've talked about in other classes. So you find in that transition time period, guess who coming forward? Yeshua, born probably either 6 or 5 BC. He certainly wasn't born in the year 0 or 1 because we know from the Bible in multiple places that King Herod was alive when King Herod I was alive when Jesus was alive, when he was born. And we know absolutely without any question when Herod died. We know the month and day and year in which he died. And since he died in 4 BC, Jesus had to have been born before 4 BC, unless the Bible is completely wrong. Um, but assuming any of these dates, then he was born probably, and he was a year or two old when Herod supposedly had the edict to try to kill all male children under the age of 2 because he was afraid the Messiah had been born, who would usurp his throne. That would put Jesus' birth at 5 or more likely 6 in that era of BC. So that's a huge influx right then. And um, and that was a time also of great evil and a time of great conflict between good and evil in both personal levels and what people understood and how they were choosing to live, and in terms of cultural levels, what moral values they were adopting, because they were changing radically in that time, just like they are radically in this time also. Because guess what? What period are we in? We're in that transition. We're only 26 years into it. So we're in the fading of the previous age and the beginning of the coming forth of the newer one. And it's not established at all yet. So huge, huge turmoil during these times, worldwide turmoil, personal turmoil, cultural chaos, moral chaos, happened then at the time of Jesus, happening again now. And kind of on schedule, if you put any credence at all into the sort of my theory or my perspective as I look at historical timelines of things. The fact that we're in that surge now, both positive and negative, is something I would have expected based on what I've looked at historically. And to me, that does seem to be happening. Okay, so I'll move on. Another huge change, by the way, during that same transition era I'm talking about. Jesus was already dead by this time, but a huge, huge, huge change that affected the world, didn't seem to at the time, but it did, was Rome utterly destroyed the temple and outlawed Judaism and later outlawed Christianity, then, of course, later adopted Christianity. But when the temple was destroyed, the temple, it's hard to imagine for a non-Jew who doesn't know their own history well, it's hard for anybody to imagine the centrality the temple played in Jewish life. Um, a lot of people today, for example, think that synagogues, the local small gathering places, were uh, which were prominent throughout Judaism, um, that those were places of prayer and study. But actually, that's wrong. Synagogues were never places of prayer until after the temple was destroyed. They were places of study. And all of the ancient inscriptions that they've ever found at a synagogue or any writings about the synagogue that they found all talk about it as being a place of studying the Torah. It was a place the Torah was read because most of the population was illiterate and the priesthood was not. And of course, certain individuals weren't, but by and large, they were. Estimates are between 80 and 95% of the populace were illiterate at that time. So it was where the Torah was read and then expounded upon and explained, if you will, because there's a lot of contradictory and confusing stuff in Torah, like there is in all scripture. That's where that happened. That's what the synagogues were for initially, where the law could be taught to the people who couldn't read it and therefore couldn't follow it. So they taught what the law said and then taught this is how you apply it. So that was done locally in synagogues, not at the temple. But prayer was not done at the synagogues at that time. Much later, when Rabbinic Judaism began to grow up, because Temple Judaism couldn't exist anymore, there was no more temple after 70 AD, then the thing shifted. And instead of animal sacrifice as a means of prayer and as a means of atonement and as a means of offering to the Lord and all these different things that animal sacrifice, all the functions it performed, then these clever and brilliant rabbis, in order to not see the death of Judaism, said, okay, well, now the sacrifice you need to perform daily is, and at certain festivals, is prayer. And the place you need to perform that is in your home and to gather together to do it in the synagogues. So there was a huge shift. And that shift affected Jesus and ultimately Christianity because he started as a home ministry. He taught in the local synagogues and he gathered together with groups of students and friends in homes. That's how that started because that's what Judaism did. And he was Jewish, thoroughly Jewish his whole life. All of his disciples were Jewish during his lifetime, and they all continued to be Jews during their lifetime. So they went to the temple and did all the temple things until it was destroyed. And then his followers after his death and after the death of the temple then switched to this home-based teaching and so on. And synagogues then incorporated both study and prayer into them. So that was another big shift in this age transition between the ages back then of Aries and Pisces. So that happened. So I'm going to skip ahead now to kind of get through the timeline. This takes a bit of time, I know, but I hope this is at least somewhat interesting, and it's going to be informative when we study some of these teachers, I hope. So skipping ahead to the 1200s.
Stephen, this is Liz.
Hi, Liz.
Yes, yes, it's interesting. And I'm just going to interrupt you.
Yeah.
Sometimes you ask us for suggestions for classes.
Yeah.
And sometimes you're doing a class, you're like, oh, I shouldn't spend too much time on this. I shouldn't spend too much time on that. Maybe you should. Does that make sense?
Cool. Sure. Thanks.
Okay. But
Appreciate it.
I really enjoy this. Thank you.
Oh, good. Well, thank you. Appreciate it. I do appreciate it. So skipping forward to the AD period, looking at, again, that a roughly 1200 and roughly 1500 period, did anything happen then in terms of big influences or big surges in Christianity? And the answer is yes, absolutely, absolutely it did. And so I'll just mention a couple here so I can move on to a little bit to other things tonight. But in the 1200s, late 1100s, early 1200s, this person called Francis of Assisi, we now know as Saint Francis, came forward with his life and teachings. And while she's not talked about nearly as much, it's mostly Saint Francis and his brotherhood that's talked about. At the same time, his dear, dear friend, and not lover, but love of his life, Clare, started the feminine side of that. And she started a sisterhood, the Poor Sisters of Charity, or I've forgotten the exact name she was called, something along those lines. And she was teaching as well and had her own female followers as he had male followers. And at that time, because it was all an outgrowth of the Catholic Church, which already was established, well established, which began in the late Roman Empire. Not even late, but in the Roman Empire, the celibacy was a big deal. So his monks were celibate and her sisters were celibate. But his brand of theology greatly influenced the Catholic Church and greatly influenced many other people. And a lot of the monastic orders that we see now, not all of them, but many of them, can be traced directly back to his influence and were founded on his principles and his way of, two of which were to minister to the poor and to um, not get rich off of spiritual teachings. So, which certainly a lot of people seem to violate that in certain circles these days. But that was really important to Francis, and to be compassionate to all living creatures. So he had a real rapport with animals, with the animal kingdom. Um, but that altered things a great deal, the Franciscan way of doing it. And he's, in many ways, in my mind, comparable to somebody very famous in Judaism, not so famous outside Judaism, called the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov's name was Rabbi Israel ben Eliezer, and he lived in Eastern Europe at a time when two very significant things were happening. One was there were a lot of something called pogroms, which is that Jewish people were severely persecuted. They were, at a minimum, socially ostracized, financially put in great hardship. They were often violently physically attacked. They were in many instances killed or tortured. Their homes, families, villages burned down, libraries burned down. Really awful things. Very, very heavy anti-Semitism time period, as there was in that same area of Europe during the Nazi regime, and as there is, God forbid, seems to be rising again all over the world right now, including the United States. So he had a big influence. And so that was around the 1200 period again. Now, in the 1200 period, something else really significant happens. And that is that Kabbalah, what we call Kabbalah, a lot of you, because of me or your own studies, are familiar with that. Some of you maybe not so much so. But the mystical writings of and teachings of Judaism over thousands of years by hundreds of rabbis um, greatly influenced Jewish tradition and Jewish thought, also greatly influenced Christian thought, particularly mystical Christian thought. St. Teresa, for example, of Avila, who we haven't gotten to but will, studied a great deal with Kabbalists in Europe during that era. So there was a more open interchange between people in Europe at that time who practiced any kind of mysticism, whether it was Christian or ascetic or Gnostic or Kabbalistic. And Kabbalism really surged in that era, particularly in Spain, but in Western Europe in general. And one of its big influential proponents was named Rabbi Abraham Abulafia. There are many interesting stories about him. We'll touch on him, and I'll share some of those later in the series. But his teaching, Judaism from the time of Moses, has had this sacred four-letter name that you've heard me talk about before, Yod He Vav He. In Greek, it's called the Tetragrammaton, meaning four letters. It's not actually a name. It's not actually a word. It's just four consonants that designate this boundless, timeless, unnameable, inexpressible, pure being, or pure existence, or whatever it is that we can't name. The Tao, as Lao Tzu would have probably called it. So that's been an unpronounceable, sacred, and holiest of holy names since the days of Moses within Judaism. When Abulafia came along, he taught privately in secret to students who later published a lot of his works, and it began making its way through Kabbalistic circles. And it was, how can you work with this sacred name in your inner kingdom, in meditation and prayer, to begin to awaken more fully to the reality of God, the big God, the pure being. and how can you begin to activate those qualities within yourself and your life. It was a very empowering and very powerful series of meditation practices working with the holy name that was kept secret in Kabbalah for centuries in small groups, but eventually has gotten out and got a much wider scope. And like many of the secret teachings of India that have now gotten out, it involved the use of sound and light in your meditation practice, very specific ones, as do the ancient secret Hindu ones that are not so secret anymore. So that was another huge influx in terms of spiritual awakening and understanding in that 1200 period in Western Europe. And then if you move to the 1500 period that I talked about again, guess what? There's a second one. There's a second huge Kabbalistic revival and a huge number of great teachers that come along that are now kind of the quintessential Kabbalists if you want to study Kabbalah. And this awakening or this surge did also affect those in Western Europe, but it very much affected Israel, the teachers in Israel. So the principal one of which in Israel was in the mid 1500s, 1534 to 1572. We do know his dates of birth and death. Rabbi Isaac Luria, who became known as the Ari, which means the lion or the lion of God. And then he had very famous students, Chaim Luzzatto and a number of others who started these long lineages of great teachers in Kabbalah that then spread to Western Europe, that then started their own lineages of great teachers who then drifted into something called the Hasidic line of teachers, which also continued a long time with great teachers like Rebbe Nachman and the Baal Shem Tov and others. So that all grew out of this 1500 era surge of spiritual influx in the Jewish tradition in both Israel and Europe. Um, and so that's another time period of great surge. The last two things I'll mention then on this sort of timeline for tonight is if we go back in history, this does not correspond to my 1200, 1500, or the change of ages. It does not correspond to that. But it's an interesting correlation. If you look at Western civilization, Western law, the Western justice, now granted, I know at a practical level, many, many, many flaws in the government and justice system in the United States and elsewhere. Many flaws. They're human beings. None of us are perfect, and we have a lot of corruption. We have a lot of things that shouldn't be happening and so on. But the idea that there was a civilization that actually valued justice and tried to set up standards of justice and set up court systems and set up law systems so that the powerful couldn't take advantage of the weak, so that you had an equal voice in things. That whole idea in Western civilization, epitomized in the United States and Britain primarily, historically, the foundation of those concepts that, like Edmund Burke, for example, drew on, came from two places. One place was the Mosaic Code of Law in Judaism, and the other place was the Code of Hammurabi, which preceded that by quite a period of time. The Code of Hammurabi, most scholars believe, was in 1790 or 1792, when that really came forward and began to be promulgated throughout the culture as setting up a code of morality, a code of behavior, and a system of justice, the Code of Hammurabi, around 1790 BC is kind of a commonly accepted date. Well, if you go to the corresponding period of time in this AD era, that would put you at 1790 AD. Guess what happened in 1790 AD? the Constitution of the United States of America went into effect across the country, um, and was based on the Code of Hammurabi and the Mosaic Law. Um, and then it attempted to refine those things into an even more defined and intentionally intended to be, at least, more equitable system with more safeguards built into it. Certainly, we see that those haven't all worked, but many of them have worked, and our republic has endured for almost 250 years. So that's pretty good, because if you look at like other republics of Greece and Rome and elsewhere, 250 years is a long span for a republic. Uh, so that happened at the same point in this next era as it did in the BC era, which I just find interesting. I don't really have an explanation for that, but I find it interesting. So, uh, so I'll pause there for a moment, and if there are any questions or comments, we'll do those. And if they're not, then I'll start with one of the great souls and start with them tonight. Otherwise, we'll start with them next week. So, anybody have anything you'd like to share with the group or ask?
Stephen?
Yeah.
Mommy, I'm not sure when it was, but I know that the Kabbalists were influenced quite a bit by the Sufis.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and I didn't hear you mention them, so
Yeah, I did. I did not mention the Sufis. That's true. The Islam and Muhammad era produced eventually a large number of mystics that call themselves Sufis, and out of them, a lot of people that we would recognize historically who became great poets and teachers. Mostly poets. Most of the teaching was private at that point, but yeah, in the both in the 1500, well, in the 1500s primarily in Western Europe, the mystical cultures that were sharing in Spain and France primarily were Jewish Kabbalists, Sufi, which is Islam, mystics, and Christian Kabbalists, because there were Christian Kabbalists back then also, who began to work with Jewish Kabbalistic principles in terms of Christian texts, the New Testament and Christian Christology and Christian theology, and began to apply that to a lot of their prayer and meditation practices. So those three groups were represented very heavily in the 1500s. And then a fourth group, less so, is called the Gnostic mystics. And the Gnostic mystics were kind of a combination of Christian teachings, a little bit Jewish, but mostly Christian, and a lot Zoroastrian. So they kind of combined those three things together, and had a um, sort of a Jewish way of looking at Jesus. But then the Gnostic portion, or the Zoroastrian way, was that everything at this level is a contest between light and dark and good and evil, and that the only way you can get out of that is to transcend that and go up to the one, which was called Ahura Mazda in Zoroastrianism. And I just forgot the Gnostic term for that one, but you can look it up if you want. And the so very, very similar. And yes, so big influence. Sufis are also the ones, and if you've ever done davening with a group of Jews, there's a couple of traditional things about it. One is that they're chanting the scripture they're reading. They're not reading it, they're chanting it. Sufis do that. And there's movement. And now, typically, a lot of the times, it's just a kind of a rocking movement in a lot of Jewish davening or prayers. But in some, it's a little bit more dramatic than that. And the Sufis, uh, they have a practice where there's a lot of movement. In fact, if you've seen what's in the West called the whirling dervishes, which is where they dance and spin while they're chanting and meditating, and get into ecstatic states. That's a Sufi practice as well. So all of these, th- there were different time periods, and 1500s was one of them, where all these different mystics were sharing their knowledge and teachings and practices with each other and trying them with each other, which is historically largely unheard of. So that was a really great thing in my estimation in many ways.
Model
And
for us.
yeah, yeah, no kidding, no kidding. So yeah, thank you for bringing that up. The there are some there are a lot of I don't want to get into this, but there are Islam as a religion now and the texts it has now. That's one thing, and we can talk about that. The Quran and what its teachings are, and so on, and different forms of Islam, like different forms of uh, Judaism and Christianity, and so on. But the actual history of Muhammad and who he was and what he did and how Islam developed um, is is way more problematic than people realize it is. Um,
Mm.
and so, but what we have now is something we can definitely talk about. But who he was and what he did is many historians challenge the stories about him with many good reasons. So that's a very contentious thing in history right now. And since I'm not a historian, I'm not qualified to talk about that. But I just know there's a lot of and to traditional Muslims, it's extremely disturbing. I'm not talking about fanatical ones, just traditional ones, because it's kind of like if you were to come out, if you could prove Jesus was never came back from the dead, never resurrected, and never ascended. If you could somehow, I don't know how you would, but if you could prove that, Christianity, traditional Christianity, would be really upset with you because it's based on that. So anyway, James, go ahead.
Hey, how's it going?
Good.
Good. Your idea on like cyclical history and things like that, or theologies, I will
Yeah,
dare
that's a good one. Yeah, yeah.
sounds a lot familiar about I took before when I was at IU back in the 90s, I only took one ancient history course.
Hmm.
I was into the more Renaissance, starting from the Renaissance going forward.
Yeah.
But I did take it, and the professor's main theme of the class of that semester was change
Hmm.
and the frequency of change.
Hmm.
So and she started with I think the Babylonians and the
Yep.
Egyptians, and
Yep.
they went forever. You know, they
Yep.
went for 1,000, 1,500
Hmm.
years,
Hmm.
and then you have the Assyrians and so on and so forth.
Hmm.
But one thing she did stress was as these regimes and these empires came, they fell faster.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I would posit on your theology thing that even in religious thought in West, or at least in Western religious thought, that's the you see the same pattern.
An acceleration.
Yeah,
Yeah.
acceleration because
Yeah.
like you have monasticism and
Yeah. Yeah.
you know in the 1200s, I believe, 1100s, and
Right.
then
Right.
you go just a couple hundred years later, and you have Martin Luther,
Yep.
you have John Calvin,
Yep.
and then you can fast forward to the 19th century with the in the United States the so-called Great Awakening. So
Hmm.
you have all these other little
Hmm.
major or minor, things coming off to
Oh,
it.
for sure.
So I think, and I would tend to think that the two are kind of related. Because especially with Martin Luther, because you see serious political and socioeconomic regimes changing
Oh, yeah.
religious thought. And I would bet if we go back far enough, my expertise kind of starts at 500 BC. So
Right.
I can't go back any further, but
Right.
I would suggest that as the theological slash philosophical thought changes, I bet it's directly related
Oh, I
to
think so.
the fall and the things like that.
Yeah, I would definitely think so. And as we know from our current world situation, um, ideology drives a lot of our economy and politics and social structures and all of that. So I think that's very likely, and I think to me that's a fascinating study. I'm trying to do a kind of a big picture because I know some people like their eyes glaze over when you. The two things that I found make people eyes glaze over real fast are talking about history, which to me is just intriguing. I mean, like I light up when you start talking about history. But and then the other is like quantum physics or superstring theory. You
Oh,
start
yeah,
talking about, and I light up with that too. But
yeah.
most people are like, no thanks, you know. So
Well, if you're looking for something to research,
yeah,
I would suggest the third century CE,
okay.
because at that point you have the Roman Empire.
Constantine, yeah,
Yeah, well, this is about 80 years before.
yeah,
But you have the Roman Empire almost falling due to various things.
yeah,
Persia switches out about 220. You
yeah.
go from the whoever they were to the Sasanians. I can't remember who it would be before, and not the Achaemenians, but the ones in between.
Hmm.
And then you keep on going eastward. There's a regime change, a huge one in India.
Oh yeah, oh yeah,
The Mauryans die out,
yeah,
and
yeah.
then you go all the way to China, and you see the Han Empire going breaking up into the three kingdoms.
Right.
So I bet you if you look close enough somewhere, there's something going on at the same time in more of theological reasons.
I think so too. That would be to me that would be a really interesting study. And if I ever actually retire, I'll probably do that. But
Yeah.
for me, it's hard to study that a little bit because it's so interesting to me that it's like going down the rabbit hole. I get like obsessed, and then it's kind of all I do. So
Yeah.
I'm not very productive when I get on a binge
No,
like
I
that.
do deep dives as well, but yeah, third century CE and 17th century CE are in terms of like socioeconomic change and political change aligned with theology.
Yeah,
So
for sure.
in the
For
17th
sure.
has to have happened in the third.
Well, if you just look at in kind of that area you're talking about, if you just look at, for example, the World Church Councils that were held and
Mhm.
the effect that had on what became Christianity, it
Yep.
just revamped everything,
Mhm.
And so,
Yeah.
yeah.
And I would
And a
say
lot of that was not religiously driven, it was politically driven.
yes. Oh yeah, definitely
Yeah.
the ascent of Christianity is definitely politically driven.
Yeah.
But I would suggest that that's a direct result of what happened in the third century, than what Constantine did in the fourth.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
there you go.
That's great, James. Thank you for the suggestion. Yeah. Because I'm much more familiar with the fourth,
Mhm.
with the Council of Nicaea and Chalcedon and Nicaea, all those things, and then the various, um, and then again, it's with the various churches, the Eastern Orthodox, and then the Coptic splitting off, and the Roman and that whole era. But as you said, I think the seeds of that were the century before that. So,
Yeah, the
and
much
I'm less familiar with that for sure.
yeah much upheaval.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's a whole different discussion.
Yeah. Yeah. So, so see if you get here this summer and we get a chance to hang out, we can go over some of those things.
That I'm
I'll let you,
yeah, I'm going to see what I can do.
I'll let you teach me some of that stuff. That'd be
No.
great. Yeah. All right. Thank you, James. Anybody else? Yeah, surely.
Um,
Ordinary.
I'll be quick. I'm gonna be a troublemaker and go off topic. And so here's your religion thingy for the week.
Good. Okay, good.
So you know that, well, besides, yes, duh, today's Easter. Um, in our Haftorah reading yesterday, it was Ezekiel 37.
Hmm.
It's my favorite, dry bones.
Yep.
I don't know why it's my favorite, but it's my favorite. And I always find it entertaining when we don't read it every year. It just depends on how it falls because it's usually the one we do for Passover, which is still going on.
Right.
So
I forgot to say Hag Sameach to everybody for Passover. Sorry.
so
Thank you.
so I always find it interesting because it's Ezekiel and God telling Ezekiel, go prophesy over these dry bones and I'll give them life and they will live again.
Yeah.
Then you have the juxtaposition of Easter being the next day, and there you go. The rest, it's supposedly the resurrection and all that.
I know. I know.
I just always find it entertaining when they happen to be right after each other.
I do too. I always do as well. Yeah, I love that. So um, yeah, that's a if anybody isn't familiar with that, look that up because it's really interesting story, and you'll see tons of parallels to the Christian Easter story in the Gospels. So yeah,
Yep. And Auntie's hiding. Where is she?
she is not feeling well today, so she is laying down right now. Yeah,
We'll
yeah.
give her our love, please.
Thank you. I will do that. I will do that.
Please.
Yeah. So, gosh, so we're out of time here already. I know it was mostly me tonight trying to sort of lay the timeline thing, but so next week we'll start up and start going through some of these teachers and how the similarities and differences between their sort of key teachings and what influence that may have had culturally and historically, and also how, if any of them are things that are useful to us or coincide with our life experience, whether they fit with us or whether they don't. So I hope you can join me next week, and thank you all for being here tonight. I hope you have a blessed week and a wonderful holy season of Passover and Easter, and also just the holy season of spring and all the rebirth that's going on in the world around us as well. So um,
You.
all right.
Mhm.
Yeah. So again, thank you very much. And we'll just take a moment of quiet. And just invite you just for this moment, because I know there's so much trouble we see around us in the news and in so many places. Just take this moment to remember that there are a lot of good people in the world who are genuinely seeking the truth, not trying to promote a particular agenda, and who genuinely feel compassion for others and are doing their best to live lives of loving kindness. And that it's important to remember you're not alone in that process. And even though we all fail at it from time to time, our commitment to it does not. And for that, I'm grateful. So thank you all for being with me tonight. I appreciate it. Good night.